From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Tuesday, February 4. The biggest business body in the country says Anthony Albanese has no choice but to revisit his government's 82% renewables target. Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry Chief Executive Andrew McKellar says business owners want gas to play a bigger role as energy prices soar. Industry groups, activists, unions and individuals have a plan to influence swing voters at the next federal election. They're building campaign war chests worth millions of dollars, and they'll use new technology to target voters where their ballots are needed most. Those stories are live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Global politics is in a spin after US President Donald Trump slapped hefty tariffs on some of America's closest allies and neighbours. So what's this really all about? We unpack it in today's episode. Donald Trump loves a tariff. And on Sunday, he invoked a little-known slice of the law to slap levies on some of America's biggest trade partners.
We'll see how it is, but it's a lot of money coming to the United States. They've treated us very unfairly.
From Tuesday, the US will impose a 25% levy on imports from Canada and Mexico, as well as a 10% tariff on energy products from Canada and an additional 10% tariff on China. It's the first time the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which gives the president broad powers during crisis situations, has been used to impose tariffs. President Trump says it'll stop the flow of the highly potent opioid fentanyl into the US.
China makes the fentanyl, gives it to Mexico, puts it through Canada, puts it through different places, mostly Mexico, but also a lot through Canada. And so all three haven't treated us very well.
I think Donald Trump is harking back to a previous era of protectionism of the 50s and 60s when the United States was on top economically, militarily and socially.
Joe Kelly is The Australian's Washington DC correspondent.
I think he thinks that by reverting to protectionism, he might be able to adopt a philosophy where America is making everything at home. So far, we don't know what measures Canada, Mexico or China would need to take for these tariffs to be lifted. He hasn't spelt that out. It's not clear. I think this raises the question about whether the tariffs are an end in themselves. And he said in his inauguration speech that by putting tariffs on other countries, he would enrich America. I think he's aware that there are going to be some growing pains associated with this philosophy, this approach that he's taken. How this all plays out in the end is unpredictable. I don't think anybody knows.
These new duties will apply to everything from fresh produce like avocados to cars and tech products. And they're estimated to affect just over $2 billion in annual trade. It means American importers will pay a tax on whatever they're bringing into the country from Canada, China or Mexico. It's a lot for small businesses in particular to cop, and that means they'll likely pass the extra costs along to consumers.
Tariffs don't cause inflation, they cause success. And so we're going to have great success. There could be some temporary short-term disruption, but the tariffs are going to make us very rich and very strong, and we're going to treat other countries very fairly.
Joe, Donald Trump acknowledged that these tariffs could push consumer prices up, but he said they'll be beneficial in the long run. How does that play for him among an electorate that arguably elected him based on a belief that he would bring inflation down and lift everyday Americans out of a cost of living crisis?
The honest answer to that question is no one's sure how it's going to play out, but Donald Trump was very clear about his commitment to implement tariffs during the presidential election campaign. So this is what Americans voted for. Of course, they can still be used as a tool to extract concessions, but this means that real pain will be inflicted, and that pain will also fall upon American workers. There are estimates that have been done by think tanks over here suggesting that potentially hundreds of thousands of American jobs could be lost based upon the tariffs that are now being implemented.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum says she's prepared to open up a dialogue with President Trump about the tariffs.
Siempre vamos a mantener el diálogo. Es fundamental en la relación.
Beijing hasn't said much at all outside of its pledge to protect its trade interests. But on Monday, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau returned fire in Donald Trump's new trade war.
Unfortunately, the actions taken by the White House split us apart instead of bringing us together. Tonight, I am announcing Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods.
Trudeau's former finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, who's gunning to replace him as Canada's leader when he steps down later in the year, didn't hold back either.
I think we as Canadians need to really recognize the gravity of what has just happened. This is an illegal and unjustified action. This is a betrayal of America's closest friend and best ally. This is economic warfare, and it is incredibly important for us to hit back and to hit back hard.
In a post to Truth Social, Donald Trump said the solution was simple: become America's 51st state. Joe, what's the calculus for Donald Trump here? Does he actually want Canada to be part of the United States, or is something else going on?
This is just the starting point. This trade war could escalate, and it could escalate rapidly from here. I think there's a general opinion that hopefully this trade war can be de-escalated and it can be ended. But that's going to be difficult if there's a three-way standoff and you've got all these countries putting tariffs on one another. Donald Trump will want something in return for taking the tariffs off. He'll want to be seen to win the trade war. Both Canada and Mexico, in their responses, expressed disappointment that the United States had chosen confrontation rather than collaboration. Both say they are willing to work with America to try and address that problem as partners, and they're disappointed that the approach America's taken under Donald Trump is one of confrontation. I'm not saying that Donald Trump will always choose confrontation rather than partnership, but he's showing that he's prepared to use confrontation, even in dealing with close allies.
Coming up, what our journalists make of Donald Trump's new trade war. There are a lot of moving parts and a lot of unknowns in this new trade war. So I called up some of the Australians' experts to get their take on it. Judith Sloan is an economist and a company director, and it's safe to say she's not a fan of tariffs.
Well, of course, economists are opposed to tariffs because basically we think they distort prices and distort trade, and in the end, the country that's imposing the tariffs ends up worse off. He doesn't seem to understand that when two parties trade with each other, both the seller and the buyer benefit. His view seems to be that if America's buying goods and services that America could produce, that is somehow a form of theft or undesirable. And then he seems to link this to the inflow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants. But there's no what I'd call KPI to this. It's not clear what the Canadians need to do, the extent to their actions to discourage those things, which would allow Trump to change his mind.
Judith says Trump does have a point, up to a point.
So economists were very big on what we call the rules-based order, the World Trade Organization, people complying with agreements that they make. But the reality of that world was that it was a crooked world, and people cheated, countries entered into trade agreements that they then broke. So Trump has a point in the sense that in his world, he's not replacing something that's perfect. He's replacing something that actually is relatively dodgy. Now, my argument would be, well, let's see how we can work to improve that world and how we can improve compliance with the rules, because everyone benefits if that happens. But, Trump's going in the opposite direction and saying, well, look, I don't think we can fix that world. I'm creating another world.
The thing is, it might all be for naught.
He's such a sort of unpredictable character. He could easily lift the tariffs as he's imposed them quite quickly as well. So it's a very, very volatile environment at the moment.
Our foreign editor, Greg Sheridan, reckons the whole thing is a bit silly, but that doesn't mean it won't be a win for President Trump 2.0.
With Trump, everything is a negotiation, and these tariffs, I think, are also the starting point of a negotiation. On the other hand, it strikes me as pretty silly for the United States to embark on a trade war with Canada, a fellow NATO ally and its closest neighbour and fellow liberal democracy and so on. That's one of the weaknesses of Trump, that he tends to beat up on allies even more than he beats up on adversaries. Having said all that, it's rather unpredictable. Trump wants to redirect foreign investment because of tariffs to make it more profitable to build things in America for the American market. For that to work, really, you have to have tariffs in place for a long time, whereas I don't think these tariffs will be in place for a long time, although it's very hard to say. One of the weird things about this is that his objection to Mexican and Canadian behaviour is not really trade behaviour. It's policing illegal immigrants entering into the US and policing the trafficking of fentanyl across their borders. That makes it very difficult for either country to know what actions would take that would be sufficient for Trump to lift the tariffs. So it's very messy. The long-term consequences are a bit unclear. You would expect, because Mexico and Canada and the United States are so deeply integrated economically, that the Mexicans and the Canadians will find a way to placate Trump and the tariffs will be lifted relatively quickly. And the other reason for expecting that is because a certain number of American jobs, not a trivial number, some tens of thousands, would be affected by tariffs, especially on Canadian energy exports to the United States. The situation is pretty much as clear as mud. And as with most things with Trump, there's a genuine grievance that he's addressing. He is likely to get Canada and Mexico to do what he wants, but these tariffs are an incredibly messy and potentially counterproductive way to go about it.
The Australian's policy editor, Tom Dusevic, put a local spin on things for me.
Tariffs are dumb, and depending on the second round effects, as countries impose their own penalty taxes on US goods, it mucks up supply chains, hurts trade and growth, and could be inflationary. RBA Governor Michelle Bullock said before Christmas, when the details weren't yet known, that ultimately, if it's not good for the Chinese economy, it isn't good for us either. But if China is forced to divert trade away from the US, then we may be the beneficiaries of cheaper prices, for instance, as China's got to do a fire sale of the sorts of things it might sell into America. And if China's economy is hit hard, then Beijing might respond with huge government spending that could benefit our exports of commodities. So we won't know for quite some time how that will play out, those second round effects. But we're not really in the gun, so to speak, because we run a trade deficit with America. They run a trade surplus with us. So we're not going to be on their radar as a sort of troubled nation that they need to muscle around with trade sanctions like tariffs.
Tom Dusevic is The Australian's policy editor, Greg Sheridan is our foreign editor, Judith Sloan is a contributing economics editor, and Joe Kelly is The Australian's correspondent in Washington, DC. You can read all their reporting and analysis of Donald Trump's tariff war right now at theaustralian.com.au.